Welcome to chapter 15. We are about to delve into the cardiovascular system. So first thing to note, medical terminology. Make sure that you are looking over the medical terminology. These are the terms that are commonly used when you're talking about the cardiovascular system, the circulatory system. As with other terms, you will not only see them in this chapter or when you have someone talking about the cardiovascular system, but this is where these terms are most commonly used. As an overview, we can talk about either the cardiovascular system or the circulatory system. When we're discussing the cardiovascular system, generally, we're talking about the heart and the blood vessels. So cardio referring to the heart, vascular referring to the vessels. So the system that is composed of the heart and all the blood vessels. Whereas the circulatory system includes not only the heart and the blood vessels, but also the blood that is circulating within it. This is a diagram of the heart. Make sure that you are getting familiar with this. There are several images of the heart throughout this PowerPoint. Look at each of those images. Get familiar with the structures of the heart from all the different angles. This happens to be an anterior view of the heart. So you have structures like the right atrium, and the right auricles. So this is the first part of the heart that deoxygenated blood comes into. So you have blood from the rest of the body, you have blood from the head and neck that gets deposited into the superior vena cava. Vena cava is the largest vein. Then you have the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava receives blood from the head and neck, the deoxygenated blood from the head and neck. The inferior vena cava receives deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body. Reminder, in images, you usually have your veins in blue and your arteries in red. This signifies the veins being deoxygenated and the arteries being oxygenated. And throughout the body, in most of the body, the veins will be blue and deoxygenated, or deoxygenated and colored blue. The arteries will be oxygenated and colored red. I'll tell you in the one instance where those colors don't fit that pattern. So you have blood coming from the body, the head and neck, and the rest of the body. It gets deposited into this right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood gets pushed into this right ventricle. From the right ventricle, the blood gets pushed up. Remember, this is deoxygenated, meaning it has little oxygen, so it needs more oxygen. So it gets pumped from the right ventricle into the right pulmonary trunk, and that will lead you into the pulmonary arteries. So pulmonary arteries, you have the left one that goes to the left lung here. You have the right one that will go to the right lung here. And you'll notice that the pulmonary artery is actually blue because it supplies deoxygenated blood. Remember, I told you before, throughout the body, you normally have arteries that take blood away from the heart that are oxygenated. So those colors are going to be red. Like this structure next to the pulmonary artery, you have the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. That's red, it's oxygenated. But the pulmonary artery is blue because you're taking this deoxygenated blood and it literally just came from the rest of the body into the atria, into the ventricle, and now it's going to the lungs to be oxygenated. Once it gets oxygenated, then of course it'll be depicted as red. You have the pulmonary veins. Veins take blood to the heart. So you have these veins taking the blood to the heart from the lungs. So these pulmonary veins are going to be red because now they are oxygenated, as opposed to what normally happens when veins are bringing blood to the heart. They are deoxygenated, so they're blue. So the place where this will be different from the rest of the body is the pulmonary artery. and the pulmonary vein, where in this particular case, this artery is going to carry deoxygenated blood and the vein is going to collect oxygenated blood. And the rest of the body is going to be just the opposite. So back to how circulation flows in the heart. Once the blood goes into the lungs, it gets oxygenated, it comes back into the pulmonary veins, the left one and the right one. It goes into the left atrium. That gets pumped into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it gets pumped into the aorta, and from the aorta, it goes into the rest of the body. That is how blood circulates in general. This image is an image of the posterior side of the heart. Remember, I said that this is the anterior side. So this is the back side, the posterior side of the heart, where you can see the back of the aorta. You can see a different view of the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. You can see the pulmonary veins that are oxygenated, carrying blood back to the heart. It's going to take that blood to that left atrium. That left atrium, as I mentioned before, is going to pump blood into the left ventricle, and then that's going to go into this aorta that's going to bring blood to the rest of the heart. The other structures that you want to be mindful of when you're learning the heart are this apex of the heart. Apex is like the pinnacle of something, or the point of something. And in this particular case, the pinnacle or point happens to be on the inferior side of the heart. So those of you who are going into the health professions, you want to keep in mind that this is the apex of the heart. As you learn your physical exams, you'll learn to locate that. You may have to palpate it so that you can feel how much pressure is in the apex of the heart, so that you can gather that information when you're assessing your patient. Another thing that you need to know is the coronary vessels. So coronary means heart, or pertaining to the heart, just like cardio means pertaining to the heart. The coronary vessels are not the same as the rest of the cardiovascular vessels, in that the coronary vessels are those vessels that supply the heart itself with blood, oxygen, nutrients. So these vessels that are on the outside of the heart are coronary vessels. All of these vessels are here to actually feed the heart muscle. The blood that flows from the vena cava into the atria ventricles, into the pulmonary vessels, into the atria ventricles, into the aorta, that goes straight through the heart. That does not actually feed the heart itself. So the heart has to have its own particular blood circulation, blood vessels, helping it to get fed, helping it to get what it needs so that it can keep pumping throughout the entirety of your life. This is the overall structure of the anterior of the heart from an anterior view. From the posterior view, you'll have basically the same structures. So here on these outsides, you have these coronary vessels. Again, your veins will be in blue. Your arteries will be in red. You have the left atrium. Again, that is receiving blood from the pulmonary veins, that oxygenated blood from the lungs, to be put back into regular general circulation. This is a view of an actual heart. So here, this is also the anterior portion of the heart, or an anterior view. You can see this is the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium. You have your pulmonary trunk, which leads to the pulmonary arteries on that side and this side, supplying the lungs on either side with deoxygenated blood so that it can be oxygenated. That blood will then go back into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, and then be fed to the rest of the body through the aorta. This is basically where the heart sits in the body. So we usually think about it being on the, it's sort of in the middle of the thoracic cavity, but slightly off to the left. And that's what this image is showing you, that it is basically midline, but off to the left some. Just to reiterate, the apex of the heart is this inferior portion. The base of the heart, again, we normally think of a base as something being at the bottom. In this case, the base of the heart is the superior aspect of the heart. So base is the superior aspect, apex is the inferior aspect. When you look at the heart and you look at the lungs in the thoracic cavity, you'll see again that the heart is median to the lungs, or the lungs are lateral to the heart. The diaphragm sits inferior to the heart. And you can see that they have this film around the heart, film around the lungs. Those are your membranes, right? So remember in chapter 5, we talked about the different types of cells and membranes. So this is your pericardial membrane, and this is your pleural membrane, just as a refresher. When you look at the heart a little bit deeper, looking at this little section here, that's what this is blown up. That pericardial membrane is actually a two-layered membrane. Again, this is just review. Two-layered membrane, you have the visceral pericardium, so the visceral aspect is closest to the organ. And then you have the parietal aspect, or the parietal pericardium, that is further away from the heart tissue itself in comparison to the visceral pericardium. Looking at the muscle tissue of the heart itself, you have endocardium, myocardium, and epicardium. The endocardium is a lining, the inside lining of the heart. Myo means muscle. This is the heart muscle, so all of this is myocardium. And then the epicardium is the visceral visceral pericardium. So that visceral layer of membrane is what we call the epicardium. And this is also showing you again, you have these coronary blood vessels. When we say coronary blood vessels, we're talking about the blood vessels that are there on the outside of the heart, and then it dives deep into the heart muscle to actually feed the heart muscle itself, because all the rest of the blood that goes through the heart, it doesn't cross this endocardium to feed it, so it literally just runs straight through. So you need a way to actually feed the heart itself. This chart, make sure that if you are a visual person and you're good with charts, check out this chart so that you can look at the different layers, what they're composed of, and what the function of each part is, or each layer is. So when you open up the heart, you'll notice several different structures. So we're going to go back from the beginning. So again, blood comes into the heart from these vena cava. This is the inferior, taking blood from the rest of the body. Superior, taking blood from the head and neck, and it's going to come together and dump the blood into the right atrium. So there's this hole here that leads from the vena cava into the right atrium. The right atrium is then going to pump that blood into the right ventricle through a valve. This valve is called the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is going to open into the ventricle, because it is going to open when the right atrium pumps, sort of forcing the valve open so that the ventricle can receive that blood. I'm gonna go to the next slide where you cut off some of that pulmonary trunk, and then you can see, where is it? So when after it goes from the right ventricle, it's ready to go back into the lungs to get reoxygenated. It goes into this pulmonary trunk, past the pulmonary valve, That pulmonary valve is going to open this way into the pulmonary valve so that the blood can then flow into the pulmonary arteries, get into the lungs, the right and the left lungs, so that it can be oxygenated. That blood is going to come back through the pulmonary veins into that left atrium. From the left atrium, it'll get pushed into the left ventricle through the mitral valve, which is also called the bicuspid valve. From the left ventricle, it will go into the aorta through the aortic valve. So in the heart, you have 4 valves. You have tricuspid, you have the pulmonary valve, you have the mitral or bicuspid valve, and then you have the the aortic valve. Those are the 4 valves of the heart. Another thing that you want to notice about the heart structure, you notice that the myocardium of the left heart is much thicker than the myocardium of the right side of the heart. And this is for a very practical reason. Remember that the right heart is responsible for bringing blood to the lungs, which are literally right next to the heart, so that it can be oxygenated. The left side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood into the aorta, which is then going to pump blood throughout the entirety of the body. So from your head to your toes, it's getting blood from the left side of the heart. This is why the left side of the heart is much bigger, because it needs to have more force to be able to pump the blood from the heart throughout the entirety of the body. Whereas the right side of the heart, it doesn't need to be as muscular because the blood is not going as far to get oxygenated. The next structure you need to know are these. Here it says chordae tendineae. These are tendinous cords, chordae tendineae, that attach to the valves and to these structures called papillary muscles. The papillary muscles are muscles that are responsible for helping to open the valves and keep them open long enough for the atria to pump blood into the ventricles. And so once the atria squeezes or pumps, it's going to force the blood through the valve, but these chordae tendineae are going to help keep those open as long as the atria are squeezing, so that the blood can flow out of the atria and enter the ventricles pretty easily. And the papillary muscles are going to help that happen. The final thing on this image that you should know is the interventricular septum. So inter meaning between, ventricular pertaining to these ventricles, septum. A septum is like a division or a wall in between something. So this is the interventricular septum between the 2 ventricles. We'll talk more about the interventricular septum later on when we talk about the electrical impulses that flow through the heart that allow the heart to beat. This image shows an actual dissection of heart tissue. So as I mentioned before, the left side of the heart is much more muscular than the right side of the heart, because this is the side of the heart that's responsible for pumping blood throughout the entire body, whereas this doesn't need to be as powerful because it's only pumping blood to the lungs. All right, so you have your atria here and here, you have your ventricles here, you have your interventricular septum there. All right, so when you're talking about the way the blood circulates, we talk about the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So the pulmonary circuit is that route the blood takes to go from the heart to the lungs to get oxygenated and then back to the heart. So that is the right side of the heart, Remember, it's getting the blood from the vena cava, carrying it to the lungs to get to have that gas exchange. So take in more oxygen, get rid of some carbon dioxide, and then send it back to the heart. So you need to know the difference between the pulmonary versus systemic circulation. Systemic circulation is the left side of the heart, where you get now you have this oxygenated blood that just came from the lungs, and it's being shipped throughout the rest of the body until it returns back to the heart. If you are more visual, this is basically the same thing, just in words, talking about the difference between systemic circulation, pulmonary circulation. So as you're studying this, if you need more images, you can use this if this type of image is good for you, or you can actually use this picture if this works for you. This is the same idea. So this shows your pulmonary circuit. So from being taken into the vena cava, into the vena cava, to the right side of the heart, into the pulmonary vessels, into the lungs, supply with oxygen, remove the carbon dioxide, send it back to the heart to begin the systemic circuit. Once it gets back to the heart, it's oxygenated. It goes into the left side of the heart to go into the aorta, and the aorta feeds the rest of the body so that you can do what you do. Then it goes back into pulmonary circuit. Be sure to look over this image so that you can understand the pathway that the blood goes when it's going through the heart. It's basically what I'd already mentioned, but it shows you a little bit more detailed and concise. So be sure to pay attention to this. Again, coronary circulation refers to those blood vessels that are on the outside, and then it dives deep into the heart muscle to actually feed the cells of the heart themselves. This is an angiogram showing you the circulation in the heart. So what they did here was they gave the person a contrast dye. This person took the contrast dye orally, or it might have been injected into their bloodstream, but it gets into their circulation either directly or indirectly, and it sort of lights things up so that when they do the MRI or the CT scan, it lights it up so that you can see it more readily. And this is what you're seeing. This is normal circulation in the heart, feeding the actual tissues of the heart. Now, if this person were to have a heart block and what's the word? Myocardial infarction, which is another name for a heart attack. Heart attack is caused because cells and tissues of the heart die from not getting oxygen and nutrients. So if you saw this was all lit up and then all of a sudden you couldn't see anything past this spot right here, then that would be where the blockage is located, showing you that none of this blood is actually flowing, but the vessels here there's no blood flow. So this is a way to see where you have blood flow throughout the heart, and if there's any damaged portions of the heart. If there was damaged portion, it will be completely dark. You wouldn't see the actual vessels. So now let's talk about angina and heart attack. So angina pectoris is a type of chest pain that comes from obstruction of the coronary blood flow, but it's only partial obstruction. So there is still blood flowing throughout the vessel, but it is greatly decreased in that blood flow. And because the heart muscle cells that are downstream are not getting as much oxygen, as much nutrients, the person can have pain caused by ischemia. Ischemia is lack of blood flow, lack of oxygen. And so that tissue, it doesn't die completely because there's still some blood flow, but it does struggle a bit. Some tissues in the heart may die, but it won't be as much as if there was a complete block. Myocardium, once you have this partial obstruction, the myocardium will shift to anaerobic fermentation. So remember that this is part of a process for the cells to actually get ATP to actually function. And as we know, if there's not enough oxygen supplying a tissue for the amount of exercise that it does, then the body has to switch to alternative methods to produce ATP. The ATP that it produces, it won't be as much ATP, but you'll still get some energy. And that's what's happening here. So when you have these partial obstructions, the heart muscle will shift to anaerobic fermentation. So it's producing ATP at a much lower rate. But when it does this, you produce more lactic acid. And you should remember that when lactic acid builds up in your legs, for example, if you run a lot, if you exercise hard and you do, or you hadn't done much for a long time, then you had to be very active. 1 or 2 days later, your muscles will start to be sore because of that lactic acid buildup in your body trying to get rid of it. The exact same thing is happening in your heart tissue when you have a partial obstruction, and that is what stimulates the pain in the heart or in the chest. That is not actually a heart attack. It is just that temporary or partial obstruction of flow to the tissue of the heart itself. Angina pectoris. So then we want to talk about myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction is the name for an actual heart attack. So in medical terms, we use myocardial infarction instead of heart attack. Heart attack is the same thing. It's just the way that we say it when we're talking to lay folks or the lay public. So myocardial infarction is when you have actual death of some part, some patch of the myocardium because of long-term obstruction of the coronary circulation. So if I go back to the slide with the angina pectoris, it was partial obstruction, which means you still got some blood flow. It was just lower. Here, it is a long-term complete obstruction. So those parts of the heart muscle that are affected aren't getting any blood flow. They're not getting any oxygen. They're not getting any nutrients. They're not getting their waste picked up and removed. And all of that together contributes to the cell death. And that's what causes the problem with heart attack. So it can be an atheroma, blood clot, or fatty deposit that obstructs the coronary arteries. The cardiac muscle downstream will start to die. It'll feel like heavy pressure or squeezing pain. Sometimes in some people, that pain can radiate down the left side of the arm. This actually is not a common symptom in women who have heart attack. So that is something that you want to be mindful of as you're moving forward and you're learning about more about different symptoms, signs of disease. Do pay attention to whether or not all populations present the same. Because in females, men, women, if we're looking for this heavy pressure or the pain radiating down the left arm to indicate that they're having a heart attack, then we might miss it as healthcare practitioners because women don't have this left pain radiating down the arm as frequently as men. Sometimes heart attacks are painless. These painless heart attacks might actually cause a disruption in the electrical signals that are going from one place in the heart to the other. These are called silent heart attacks. And these silent heart attacks occur in diabetics, as well as in the elderly most often. I'm not really sure why these populations tend to have more silent heart attacks than others, but do note that diabetics and elderly patients tend to have the higher incidence of silent heart attacks. Myocardial infarction is responsible for just over a quarter of the deaths in the United States. So let's talk about the actual structure of the heart muscle. You have cardiocytes. These are heart cells. Heart cells or cardiocytes are striated, meaning they have stripes. They are shorter than some of the other types of muscle tissues that we've seen. They're thick and they're branched. They also have one nucleus that sits in the center of the cell. One nucleus that sits in the center of the cell. So these cardiocytes, or the myocardial cells, have that distinct look. When there is damage to the heart tissue, once the body has been able to begin the reparation process, most of the time that damaged heart tissue is not going to be replaced by more cardiac muscle. It's going to generally be replaced by scar tissue or fibrosis. This is another reason why heart attacks are so problematic, because even once a person recovers from the myocardial infarction, their heart will not be the same, because usually the repair is going to be fibrosis or scarring. When we first looked at heart muscle under the microscope, one of the things that we noticed were these intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. These are little dark discs. When you look at it, you can see the little dark spots, the little dark lines at regular intervals throughout the heart tissue. These intercalated discs are what join the cardiocytes with three different features. These are interdigitating folds. Look up interdigitating folds so that you can know what it means and what it looks like. It connects them with mechanical junctions and electrical junctions. All right, so your interdigitating folds, again, these are folds that interlock with each other. So if you think of digits as examples, like your fingers are called digits. If you link or lace your fingers together so that you have a finger from your left hand, then your right hand, left hand, right hand, so you have them interlocked with each other, that is sort of what interdigitating folds would look like. And what this does is it increases the surface area where the two structures connect, so that you have a stronger connection. Then you have these mechanical junctions and electrical junctions. So mechanical junctions will join your cardiocytes very tightly, and there are two types of mechanical junctions. You have the fascia adherens and the desmosomes. Fascia adherens are your broad band, where the actin of the thin myofilaments are anchored to the plasma membrane. The desmosomes are linkages that prevent the cardiocytes that are contracting, that are pumping, from being pulled away from each other. So the desmosomes are like your spot welding that holds everything together, so that as your heart pumps, the cells don't fall apart or rip away from each other. When we say mechanical junctions, we're meaning the physical connections of two structures. Electrical junctions. This is how the cells are connected, so that you can have these electrical pathway flows from one cell to another. So electrical junctions will allow ions to flow between the cells. And this is what helps neighbors stay together in how they contract. So the entire myocardium of either two atria or two ventricles act like a single unified cell. This is how your cells, your heart is actually able to pump as one unit, because you have these electrical junctions that that keep the cells pumping all at the exact same time in a unified manner. So now we're going to shift over to metabolism of the cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is almost completely dependent on aerobic respiration, meaning oxygen dependent respiration. Aerobic respiration produces the most ATP. ATP is what the heart needs to function. So we need lots of oxygen and aerobic respiration in order to make enough ATP for your heart cells to live and thrive, which means that the cardiac muscles will have lots and lots of mitochondria. Mitochondria will fill up almost a quarter of the each cardiac cell, so that you have enough mitochondria to actually supply the heart itself with adequate amounts of ATP to function. So you can see just by looking at these numbers, the fact that you have every cell in the heart, every heart muscle cell is about 25%, a quarter of the way filled with mitochondria, so that that mitochondria can produce adequate ATP to fill it. You can see it takes a lot of ATP for that to function. The heart muscles are adaptable to other fuel types. ATP, oxygen, is going to be the main type of fuel. You can also get fuel from fatty acids, from glucose, from ketones, lactic acid, and amino acids. So this is how the breakdown looks as far as the cardiocytes function and how it gets ATP in order to function, or how it gets energy to function. So fatty acids are going to produce most of the fuels, the organic fuels, then glucose, then you have your ketones, lactic acid, and amino acids. It's more vulnerable to oxygen deficiency than the lack of a specific fuel. So if you had fewer fatty acids available, your heart wouldn't really skip a beat, pun intended. Your heart really wouldn't have a problem with that, because it can switch from fatty acid, from using fatty acids as a fuel source to one of the other fuel sources, glucose, ketosis, amino acids, etc., much more readily than it can switch from having lack of oxygen. If your heart has less oxygen, that's going to impact it much more quickly and definitively than if you had to switch one of those previous fuel sources. The heart is fatigue resistant, and thank goodness it is, because it makes very little use of anaerobic fermentation or even those oxygen debt mechanisms. So make sure you're paying attention to oxygen debt. You can go back to, I believe it was the skeletal muscle chapter where we talked about oxygen debt, I think, to review that concept. But the heart muscle will not fatigue for the entirety of your life. Your heart starts to pump well before you're born, sometimes before your parents even know that you are being built, and it doesn't stop until you pass away. So this is a good thing that it is fatigue resistant. And I'm actually going to stop there for this video. I will return at the next page on the next video.